Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for braving the marathon crowd to get here today. I'm Kate Haw, Executive Officer for Exhibitions, Programs, and Audience Engagement here at the National Gallery of Art, and I am so pleased that you've joined us today for the curatorial overview of Elizabeth Catlett, a Black revolutionary artist, showcasing the amazing legacy of Elizabeth Catlett and tracing her artistic achievement over her expansive career, which spanned nearly 8 decades. This exhibition and the major scholarly catalog that accompanies it mark a milestone on this acclaimed binational artist whose work contributed significantly to the national art histories of the United States, Mexico, and beyond. In over 150 works across media and featuring iconic masterpieces alongside lesser-known works, Elizabeth Catlett, a Black revolutionary artist, examines the many ways in which Catlett dedicated her art making to furthering progressive social causes and upholding her belief that art should be accessible to everyone. The exhibition is also a homecoming for Catlett, who was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and was an alumna of Howard University. The exhibition was co-organized by the National Gallery of Art and the Brooklyn Museum, where the exhibition was on view last fall into early this year, as you can see, and we are delighted to have 2 of the exhibition's curators here with us today. Dalila Scruggs is the Augusta Savage Curator of African American Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and Catherine Morris is the Sackler Senior Curator at the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum. Mary Lee Corlett, former associate curator of modern prints and drawings here at the National Gallery, who is now retired, was the 3rd member of the curatorial team. And Lynn Matheny, curator of special projects, has stewarded the project here at the National Gallery since Mary Lee's departure. We have all been inspired by the curator's ambitious vision for this exhibition. It's been a joy to work with them, and we're grateful for their keen scholarship. Please check our website to see the robust programming around the exhibition over the next few months, including programs that celebrate Catlett's connections to Washington, D.C. and Howard University. And after today's presentation, please join Dalila and Catherine for a catalog signing of the amazing award-winning book that accompanies this exhibition, just outside the auditorium here in the East Building shop. And now I will welcome Catherine and Dalila here to the podium.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate Haw, for everything. In May 1970, denied a visa to enter the United States to participate in the Functional Aspects of Black Art CONFABA conference, Elizabeth Catlett's remarks were recorded over the telephone from Mexico, where she had made her life for more than 20 years. The previous 8 in enforced exile from her home nation. Catlett had become a Mexican citizen in 1962, at which time the United States government had declared her an undesirable alien. As she noted in her keynote address, her visa application was denied because, quote, she constituted a threat to the well-being of the United States of America. She continued in her remarks, to the degree and in proportion that the United States constitutes a threat to Black people, to that degree and more, do I hope I have earned that honor. For I have been, am currently, and always hope to be a Black revolutionary artist and all that it implies. In many ways, for me, over the course of the past several years that Dalila and I have been working on this exhibition together, this exhibition for me grows from that final clause and all that it implies, which you see on the gallery wall as we enter the exhibition. Dalila, and that's what the exhibition explores, the implications. Dalila and I are honored to be here today to tell you about the development of this project and to celebrate its opening here in Washington, D.C. This is truly a homecoming for Elizabeth Catlett, who grew up on Lamont Street. We have so many people to thank for their amazing work in bringing this show from Brooklyn to Washington and on to Chicago afterward. Kate, as I mentioned, Kaywin Feldman, of course, E. Carmos Ramirez, of course, our curatorial partners, other curatorial partners here in Washington, Mary Lee Corlett, former associate curator of modern prints and drawings, now retired, along with Lynn Metheny, who is the curator of special projects and who has been an excellent steward of this project. Rashida Whittier, formerly curatorial assistant at the Department of Prints and Drawings, was also a vital force in making this show possible. Editors, designers, installers, and so many people here who have contributed to the exhibition that we experience now. I also want to give a special shout out to Larry Hyman, who somehow managed to grapple with and marshal more loan requests than any one person should ever have to do. And also to just take a minute to thank Dalila Scruggs, who has been, and always will be my partner in crime. Thank you, Dalila.
Okay. Of course, I couldn't have done it without Catherine. And I also just want to shout out that Emily Zoss, the editor who shepherded this catalog through to completion and all the challenges that came with it, is also in the audience here. Thank you. Okay, so.
I didn't advance that.
Oh, do I say this part?
I think so.
I do. It's my project. So an avowed feminist, a lifelong activist, and a deft formalist, Elizabeth Catlett lived for nearly a century. As Catherine has so vividly described in many of the talks we've done together, Elizabeth Catlett's life has spanned this incredible century. She was born around the time of the first flu pandemic. She lived through 2 world wars, and then the first term of the Obama administration. So there's such a capacious stretch. And through it all, she had such clarity about what her practice was about.
I just want to begin for a little context for the genesis of this exhibition in Brooklyn, where Dalila and I first came together to, in a hallway in the education department. Great things always happen in the education departments of museums, to think about this show. Elizabeth Catlett's work, particularly 2 of them that you see here on the screen, Homage to My Young Black Sisters. Oops. See, I'm not good with this.
It's really hard in this. I tested
there, on the upper left, and Black Unity on the right side are 2 works that anchor this exhibition and have been shown several times at the Brooklyn Museum, including in an exhibition I co-curated with Jekyll Hockley in 2017 called We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, 1965 to 1985. That exhibition was an attempt to think through the ways that multiple communities whose work is very much informed by and part of a conversation related to feminism outside of mainstream and dominant white feminism in the United States was a way to think about how gender equity and issues that we would largely call feminist, even if that word wasn't used, are a part of the conversation in the 20th and 21st century. Elizabeth Catlett was the second oldest artist in that exhibition, and it was a wonderful opportunity when Dalila and I started talking about this to think about doing an exhibition that brings the conversation about activism in relationship to Black politics and feminism into an earlier generation, a generation, as Dalila described, who really set the stage for so much that happens in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond.
So generally speaking, our exhibition follows a chronological backbone that follows a long arc of Catlett's career. However, we don't start with her early life right away. Instead, the opening gallery begins with one of the most pivotal years in Catlett's life, 1946. In 1946, Catlett was one of the most well-prepared and focused young Black artists in the country. The year prior, she had won a prestigious Rosenwald grant, and she renewed it in 1946 for a second year. With that funding replenished, she traveled to Mexico City to study at the Taller de Gráfica Popular, or the People's Graphic Workshop, where she began working on her magnum opus, the Negro Woman Series, now later renamed the Black Woman Series. And you can see that on the back wall of the opening gallery of the exhibition here at the National Gallery. This suite of 15 prints summarizes the formal and conceptual priorities that drove Catlett's artistic vision throughout her career. And so we wanted to use it as a way of framing the entire exhibition. The series of 15 prints, sorry, it's up here. The series of 15 prints each has an incredibly poetic title, which conveys an epic tale that incisively examines Black women's lives in the ways that they are impinged by racism, classism, and gender discrimination. The work has this politicized perspective that focuses on Black female subjectivity, but with a compositional clarity, and has a key through line that underlines her entire body of work. What many people may not realize is while people tend to know the Black Women series, they may not realize it was part of a larger project of paintings, sculptures, and prints, which are on view here in the gallery, thanks to our colleague Mary Lee Corlett, who really did the groundwork to pull all these works together. This gallery actually, in effect, represents Elizabeth Catlett's first solo show, which she debuted here in DC at the Barnett Aiden Gallery. And many of the works that are on the checklist on view here on the screen are in the gallery today. I think that's
Okay. The next section of the exhibition, called Roots and Awakenings, looks at Catlett's early development as an artist in the cities that nurtured her as a young, creative and politically aware young person. These include DC, Washington, DC, obviously, Iowa, Chicago, New York, New Orleans, but particularly New York, Washington, and Chicago were the places that really served as incubators for her development as an artist and an activist. As we said, Catlett was born and raised in Washington, D.C. Her parents, her father died before she was born. Her mother raised the three siblings in Washington, D.C. Her mother, to support her family, became a truant officer in the D.C. public school system. And Catlett was granted admission to Carnegie Mellon based on the merit of her work. She was then denied matriculation because of her race. So she ended up going to Howard University at a very fortuitous time in the history of that institution, just as James Porter and other iconic figures of that era were developing in art history and an approach to collecting Black art that continues to inform the way that we look at that art history today and that part of American art history. I'll also add that this drawing on the right, this figure, Melanie Harvey does a wonderful job of describing and doing research on this work in the exhibition catalog, is a drawing of a student at Howard, a known student that posed often for classes of figure drawing. One of the things that Dalila and I talked a lot about when we were developing this exhibition was the ways in which we are building on the work of so many people and legacies that came before us. This is not a first, this exhibition. This exhibition is part of a very important lineage of work done by many, many people before us. The primary motive, the primary people in that story are people and places are HBCUs, Howard University, prime among them. And so we really felt like we wanted to make sure that this was a story that was understood in the framework of the way that Elizabeth Catlett thought of herself in history. And that was very much a part of who came before her and who was coming after her and how to support a community that existed across time and, as we will discuss, transnational politics. After graduating from Howard and teaching for a little while, Catlett decided that she would do her master's degree, and she got, in fact, one of the first master's degrees ever given in this country for studio work at the University of Iowa, where she studied with Grant Wood, and where she came to understand her priority in documenting the lived experience of Black women. What you see in the middle image here is a page from her master's thesis, the sculpture of which was an award-winning object, which was about 3 feet high. So a significant work, again, of a mother and child. This work has subsequently been lost. So if you're in a barn in Iowa and you see this, call us. And then on the right, a very important part of this exhibition and this period in Catlett's life is also painting, for which she is not so well known. She is obviously incredibly important as a printmaker and a sculptor, but she also made important inroads into thinking about paintings within a modernist idiom. And in so doing, she actually got her degree in painting from Howard. And this image on the right happens to be one of my personal favorite works in this show because of this extraordinary capturing of this very powerful image of a woman at the same time against a background which I always very much read as abstraction. I think it could be the side of a brownstone building somewhere in New York City, but it also reads to me as an experiment in abstract painting, which Catlett was very much interested in and aware of in this period in her life. In addition to that, Catlett was also always politically busy. She operated in Chicago, and then in the summer that she was in Chicago, and then the 5 years that she lived in New York, within the context of, what do we say, communist adjacent political groups.
Yeah,
what?
like Popular Front.
Popular Front groups. And she was very aware of the radical leftist politics that was happening, particularly in Black circles, both in Chicago and New York. And she actively participated in them, including teaching. And what we have on the left here is a brochure from the George Washington Carver School, where she taught how to make a dress, for example, we have here, and where she really did become aware in a very clearly class-conscious way about the value of making work accessible to people who did not necessarily have the privilege of knowing art museums or finding their ways into art galleries. At the same time, as you see on the right, she was actively engaged in the art world. Here, she and Charles White, to whom she was briefly married, are meeting with Dorothy Miller and Alfred Barr at the Museum of Modern Art. Dorothy Miller actually wrote a recommendation for her for one of her Rosenwald fellowships. So she was actively all over the place, including at Camp Wochica in New Jersey, where she taught for a summer. Wochica stands for Working Children's Camp. One of the first integrated camps that in the United States that was also driven by Popular Front politics, and just love these sort of life sort of snapshots of Catlett and Charles White at that location in Hackettstown, New Jersey, I believe.
Thank you. Oh, so I love telling this anecdote, so I'm just going to do it here again. So as you can see, Catlett was super busy in New York City. She lived in Greenwich Village, and she's taking the subway up to the Carver School. It's based in Harlem. It's working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and then grabbing, I guess, the A train back to Greenwich Village, maybe grabbing a slice of pizza. So as you can tell, as you might infer, she wasn't getting a lot of her artwork done. And so eventually a friend said, you have to get out of New York City if you're gonna fulfill your Rosenwald grant obligations. And that's why she used her second year of Rosenwald funding to go to Mexico City. Of course, Mexico had loomed large in American art for a long time, but she was attracted to it because of its politics. So after exploring those early years in New York, Chicago, and DC, we then move into a section dedicated to Catlett's time in Mexico. In the summer of 1946, Catlett travels to Mexico City, as I had said prior. And at the TGP, the Taller de Gráfica Popular, she was immersed into an international group of artists that all coalesced around the values of making a democratic art for and in the interest of the Mexican people. They aimed to create an accessible art that was produced with by producing inexpensive prints, posters, pamphlets, and flyers in a realist, legible style. And they created prints that highlighted the struggles of rural indigenous laborers, amplified the concerns of trade unions, and denounced the exploitation of the poor, and condemned European fascism and US imperialism. When she arrived there, by the fall of 1946, she became a permanent member of the TGP and became an essential contributor to the collaborative approach that was there. The TGP was a headquarters to an international hub of artists, and Catlett was integral to that collaboration, the dynamic milieu. She was a vocal participant in the TGP's weekly meetings where they debated current events, critiqued each other's work, and made decisions regarding what commissions they would take from student groups or trade unions and rural groups. Part of that, and the credit really goes to Mary Lee Corlett here. A lot of the ideas that are in this section have to do with Mary Lee's rigorous print expertise, and one of the ways that Mary Lee was working around these works is to show how integral Catlett was as a collaborator and a leader to the TGP. So on the right here, I'm showing you a selection of prints from Catlett's Against Discrimination series. This is a series where she gathered her TGP members together to work collaboratively to produce a series dedicated to celebrating African-American heroes. And so you can really see the ways that Catlett has a transnational vision, engaging Mexican artists and thinking about Black America. A facet of TGP production were scenes of working class everyday life, which they described as la lucha diaria, or the everyday struggle. And in keeping with this approach, Catlett represented rural laborers, grassroots teachers, and street vendors. These images are gathered together in a subsection of the TGP gallery, which is called El Pueblo, which can be variously translated as the village, the community, or the people in the political sense. And one of the things that I really wanted to do in this section is to emphasize again that Catlett was able to see, as she's described as her two peoples, as bound together in a solidarity. Often scholars tend to think of Catlett's Black American production and her Mexican production as being distinct enterprises. But by trying to build this checklist, one of the things I was really invested in was creating strategic juxtapositions in the galleries that would emphasize the ways that Catlett had a visual language of political solidarity. So these two works were together in the Brooklyn presentation in the gallery here at NGA. In each of these works, a wide brim hat protects its wearer from the sun while also becoming a secular halo. The shared imagery suggests that Catlett's exploration of the subject was informed by the Mexican modernist iconography of the campesino, or indentured laborer. She unites sharecroppers and campesinos' shared oppression. Black sharecroppers labored in debt peonage to white landowners in the United States, just as indigenous campesinos were forced to labor on plantations in Mexico during the Spanish colonial era and during the Porfiriato, or the Porfirio dictatorship, and before the Mexican Revolution. And so what I'm hoping that folks will come away with is that Catlett's most iconic work, this sharecropper image, is not singular, but is in fact born out of a praxis that Catlett developed in her work at the Taller de Gráfica Popular.
One of the really wonderful opportunities that Dalila and Mary Lee and I had was going to Cuernavaca together to see the studio where Catlett and her husband, Francisco Mora, lived and worked. And so we wanted to bring that in various ways into the exhibition, to also bring the notion of the very important aspect of Catlett's time in the studio working on sculpture and printmaking, together with her husband, who was also a member of the TGP and a very renowned printmaker as well. The image that you see on the right here in the installation is a photograph of Catlett's studio as it exists today, with plasters and sculptural works that remain on the property. Three more images of Catlett's studio. It's wonderful to see the way that Catlett and Mora made a studio together. They built this compound in Cuernavaca with their studios across a small courtyard from each other, with doors that opened up so that they could move back and forth very easily and visit each other and talk. The other very important thing to Catlett that we learned from her children and grandchildren was that she wanted her studio to be built off the kitchen because she was also very interested in always cooking for her family. So it's a very lovely indicator of the ways in which Catlett and Maura forefronted their families, included their families, and made the art making and their politics a part of the daily living of this family. And the image on the left is, again, one of these wonderful images up above her studio where there's a kind of clear story space with more of these plasters that still live there in that particular form.
So from the TGP, we then, so basically the 40s and 50s, we then move into the 1960s and 70s. Catlett described herself as a cultural nationalist who drew from African and Mesoamerican artistic traditions to create an art that was vigorously anti-colonial and joyfully proud of her respective heritages. So this section really is dedicated to the ways that she claims those traditions as an ancestral legacy, to borrow the phrase from Alain Locke. For time, we're going to move ahead to Global Solidarity, which shares a gallery with the Ancestral Legacies section. In many ways, they are very much correlated and interested in recovering Black pride for Black self-determination. Many artists tend to think of Catlett's Black Power period of the 60s and 70s as being the entirety of her work at the period. But in fact, we wanted to reframe this section as one of global solidarity to show the ways that Catlett was positioned kind of at the center of a global uprising around the 1960s and 70s. She was privy to the ideological cross currents of leftist activism in the United States, Latin America, and Africa and Asia, what was at the time described as a third world solidarity struggle, uniting Black and Chicano people with oppressed people around the world. For today, I want to focus on Political Prisoner. This incredible work. Oh, sorry, there's one other thing. So in this period, she's continuing to use a style that's inspired by the TGP, but she also begins to use a pop art style. This was a style that had a lot of currency during this period as a way of expressing this kind of upsurge of political protest around the 1968. And you can see just two examples of the ways that Catlett also embraces this language of pop art inspired activist language. Okay, so I'll focus on Political Prisoner as an exemplar of the ways that Catlett metabolized the cross currents of the global 60s to express messages of political solidarity. Political Prisoner exemplifies Catlett's dual desire to represent universal figures while also alluding to real life events and people. This work draws inspiration from the newswire photographs of Angela Davis. Davis was arrested at Howard Johnson Motor Lodge in Midtown Manhattan in October of 1970, and that spawned an outcry around the world to free Angela Davis, and Catlett was very much a part of that activism. Here you can see some of the similarities between the newswire photographs, but also some really strategic differences between the two. Key to me is this choice to move Angela Davis's hands that are in handcuffs to this figure and place them behind her back. And to me, they read more as slave manacles. And this ties very much into some of the philosophies and thinking of the time. Prison activists suggested that Black political prisoners were symbols of the ways that African Americans were imprisoned by the racism of the United States in the 60s and 70s. Moreover, prison abolitionists even today think of incarceration as a contemporary manifestation of the ways that slavery has informed the way we think of Black people as so linked to criminality. Beyond that, though, one of the points that I'm really hoping people take away is that Catlett wasn't just activist in the studio. Her activism extended to the streets, so to speak. So what I'm showing you on the left is a poster that was created by her son, David, and it was made for a rally that Catlett organized as a member of the proto-feminist Mexican organization, the National Union of Mexican Women. And they decided that they wanted to make sure that the Mexican people understood the facts rather than sort of the propaganda or misinformation around Angela Davis's arrest. They organized a rally, and if memory serves, Catlett was one of the speakers at that rally. Eventually, Catlett began to work more closely with the actual legal team that supported Angela Davis's case, and she made the poster on the right here. It's a cacophony of languages. It's literally intended to travel around the world and communicate to many different people, all in favor of the release of Angela Davis. Finally, this is a great case example because it shows that she's not just in Mexico thinking about Black Americans. She understands a global solidarity, and she understands how different peoples have a common goal and a common forms of oppression. So, for example, she had an interview where she explains, while she's making this piece, I have a big piece of wood sitting here in the studio, I guess for about a year now, and I wanted to do whatever I felt was strongest during the period when I started working on it. For example, what I feel strongest about now are the Black people in prisons, because I've been reading a lot. And not just about Angela Davis, but all political prisoners. We have a lot here in Mexico too. And I have been thinking about how I could express it, but at the same time, I have to think about expressing it in sculptural form so that it hits people, so that they understand and that they feel it. And so this political prisoner is an archetype that brings together Black and Mexican political prisoners. And this is a sentiment that Catlett shared with Angela Davis herself, who wrote a letter of solidarity to Mexican political prisoners from her own jail cell. So this is to say that Catlett creates universalizing figures like political prisoner because she understood that a singular figure could resonate around the world.
The next section of the exhibition is called Motherhood and Family, which is an appropriate time for me and us to shout out the Maura Catlett sons, who were an integral part of making this exhibition what it is. David Maura Catlett, who Dalila just mentioned, is an artist and worked in his mother's studio with her for 30 years. Juan Maura Catlett, the middle son, is a wonderful filmmaker who lives in Mexico City. And the oldest son, Francisco Maura, is a well-known musician who lives in New York. And just seems appropriate to start a section on motherhood and family to acknowledge their extraordinary contribution to this project. I'm paraphrasing a bit from some of Dalila's writing here, but what we see here on the screen are two important posters documenting Catlett's commitment to class politics, as we've discussed, but also feminism. Catlett used the word feminist, considered herself a feminist, and envisioned her work in relationship to the empowerment and the visibility of Black women. Recent writing on Catlett has argued that her depictions of motherhood are, in fact, a radical statement about the right to raise children safely, which is a very different positionality than a lot of the more mainstream feminism in the United States that Catlett wrote about not having that much of an interest in, to be honest. So rather than focusing on basic issues of bodily autonomy, more importantly was the idea of family and the right to raise children safely. What we see here on the left is a poster. She was a member of a proto-feminist National Union of Mexican Women, which primarily articulated the claims for women's rights in the 1960s through the notion of family, through the notion of bringing everybody along, as it were. The poster on the right is, on the left is a poster that I just want to shout out that Dalila discovered in Mexico City. And this is the first time in this exhibition that it's been presented in this context. but reproductive justice as a issue that involves everybody. The poster on the right is one that Catlett made in support of a miners' strike in which families were starved. I have pointed out, as others, the close relationship of a work like this to another important printmaker, Katie Kollwitz, who Catlett didn't know personally, but admired. And we found references of her works and books in Catlett's library in Cuernavaca, which was lovely. This juxtaposition is important because the amazing gallerist, artist, thinker, Linda Goodbryant had a long conversation with Dalila and I in which she described the radicality that is present in two images like those you see on the screen. On the right, a depiction from 1956 of a mother and child. And for Goodbryant and for us, the notion of a Black woman with her own child in a moment of quiet solidarity is, in fact, a radical act. I think that we talk a lot these days about the radical politics of rest, and I think that the implications of that in the 1940s and 50s for Black women and for Catlett has a particular resonance that I think is not necessarily as visible today, in as simple a notion of this being a reasonable and important subject for fine art making. On the left, we have one of Catlett's most well-known works called The Torture of Mothers. In relationship to this work, I have always wanted to and have read this quote that from a text that Audre Lorde wrote to white feminists. She said, "Some problems we share as women, some we do not. You fear your children will grow up to join the patriarchy and testify against you. We fear our children will be dragged from a car and shot down in the street, and you will turn your backs upon the reasons they are dying." And so the politics of both of these, but the extent of the kind of broad breadth of the ways in which Catlett was thinking about representation as an act of empowerment and truth-telling are set at different cadences throughout this show. And it's one of the really lovely experiences I think that we can have as we walk through, as Kate said, almost 80 years of production. The next section of the exhibition is devoted to Black women, is devoted to the relationships and the ways in which Catlett saw herself as part of a genealogy, as I mentioned earlier, and also part of a conversation with friends and people that she admired. One of the things that's very interesting about Catlett's sculptures in many ways is that she often asked people, including family members and friends, to pose for her, but mostly her sculptural objects are not portraits. They are archetypal, and they are images of a beauty that Catlett finds that she wants to capture, whether, as she says in her writing, the nape of someone's neck or the way a bun hits the back of someone's neck. But generally speaking, the sculptures then become larger than the individual who may have sat for the pose. Catlett also used her own body as a subject at times. The image on the left, Malcolm X Speaks for Us, I'm sharing because, as Dalila was talking about the Black Women series, one of the other kind of really beautiful ways that Catlett announces her priorities is when she speaks in the first or the third person. In the Black Women series, she speaks in the first person so that any person who's reading the titles of those works, which are a form of a poem, is, at least for a moment, expected to take a positionality that she's presenting. Also, it tells you who Catlett is speaking to. And here in Malcolm X Speaks for Us, she is talking to Black women, and she has made that clear. So again, this idea of who she is talking to becomes, to me, a very important part of the ways that Catlett represents her priorities. On the right, it is Homage to My Young Black Sisters, which I mentioned earlier. It is a work that Catlett made when she could not come into the United States, but she was determined to participate in the conversation that she saw unfolding there through media, through conversations in mail with friends, and through whatever means that she could. This is, as the title implies or says very directly, a conversation with the generation that she wants to support, whose work she sees as a continuation of the work that she had been doing for decades. And one of the things that I have particularly loved about this exploration is the ways in which Homage to My Young Black Sisters has appeared in contextualized generational conversations. On the left here from 1970, I don't have the date on there, I'm forgetting. 76, 8. Linda Good Bryant, who started the first radical avant-garde Black gallery in New York City called Just Above Midtown. The very first exhibition that she put together to open that lauded space included Homage to My Young Black Sisters. Here you see on the screen, is this how you do it? I don't know how you do it. That way. This is Linda Good Bryant in the hat. This is Lowry Stokes Sims, very important scholar and friend of Catlett's. And in the back there, you see David Hammonds. So a generation of very radical Black artists who are already looking and talking and thinking of Elizabeth Catlett as a part of the history that they are writing. Flash forward to 2018. This is an image of a closing exhibition we had in Brooklyn for the exhibition I mentioned earlier. We Wanted a Revolution, another group of Black women artists celebrating and surrounding Homage to My Young Black Sisters.
So the final section of the exhibition is dedicated to Catlett's public art. By the 80s and 90s, Catlett had won a number of commissions based on the public acclaim that she was beginning to earn in the art world and near the end of her career and her life. And so she had pursued a number of wonderful works, which we do not rip from their foundations in the galleries. Instead, we use, let me go back to maybe demonstrate that. Instead, we use half-scale sculptures, maquettes, and also there's a digital panel in the galleries, which tells the story of some of her public sculptures. For the most part, Catlett was able to realize her democratic vision of art through her printmaking, but with public art, for the first time, she's able to realize that through sculpture, which is largely in private hands or in institutions, but now she's able to place it literally in the landscape, in public, for everyday people to access. And her philosophy around that is evidenced in this quote, which is on screen. So, art in public places is only valid when it has some relationship to the community. It is not good enough to be merely functional or even beautiful. We must meet the psychological needs of our people. So you can see here some of the works gathered together. We only have one work that is an actual public sculpture, which is the one from Legler Library. It hangs from the ceiling, and it's just so whimsical, really providing that sense that reading can carry your imagination. Just want to end by highlighting one public work. There is a large-scale replica in the galleries, or reproduction in the galleries, of this work made for Howard University. Again, it was a kind of homecoming for Catlett. She was really excited to be able to do this commission for her alma mater. And so she made this with a $30,000 budget from Exxon Education Foundation. And with that funding, she created a 1.5-ton bronze sculpture called Students Aspire, which is on the facade of Howard University's School of Engineering. Before realizing this bas-relief, she, practiced what she preached. She went and met with Howard University students and teachers, and she says that she listened to what they had in mind and then incorporated it in the way that she felt was best. So she describes Students Aspire this way. Quote, 2 students are holding each other up to express unity rather than competition that exists in education. The equal sign signifies scientific as well as social equality, that everybody should be equal, men to women, students to teachers, and Blacks to everyone else. At Brooklyn, we were able to have some of these preparatory sketches where you can see the evolution of her thinking. She started really early on thinking about the history of Black scientists and engineers, people like Benjamin Banneker, George Washington Carver, these greats that form the foundations of our sciences. But then she evolved, again, moving towards the archetypal, representing this history of Black science with African masks, forming the roots of the students who then aspire and carry that forward. So this is the end of the exhibition. We just also wanted to acknowledge that there are some links in the audience, I believe, or online, who were the ones who commissioned this work by Catlett. And also there may be some members of the advisory committee for this exhibition. And it was a real honor to listen to your ideas as you developed what are some of the incredible interpretive strategies in the galleries. So I just want to end by saying that I hope that you can see through this long life that Catlett has, you can see the clear threads here, this formal rigor, this commitment to political solidarity, and just a political radicality that she never gave up. Yeah. So thank you very much.
And we're glad to take some questions if anybody would like to ask. I can repeat the question so people can hear.
Thank you for your presentation. This is incredibly timely. And I went yesterday to a talk at the National Art Gallery. It is about the Japanese art who were revolted against incarceration and what happened to the Japanese people. There is another very political show, the Bansky, right across the street. As I'm watching this and listening to you and listening to the lecture yesterday, the big question that kept coming to my mind is the timeliness of art as a voice against American capitalism, American nationalism, the timeliness of what's happening here and what's happening now. My question is, did you have any objection, whether it is direct or indirect, especially from the professor, and I see the impact of the political power intervening in education and banning certain books and banning certain topics, including Black history in America. I wonder if you really had any issues coming with this work together, and if you had any threats of budget costs or anything like that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think as a professor, you clearly know how to project your voice, so I think everybody heard you. I mean, my response to that is two things. First of all, as a curator, it's always very interesting when you work on a project such as this one, which we started in 2018. You never know what any climate is going to look like when something comes to fruition. And I think that what that just tells me, and one of the things that I think personally most interests me and drives me in thinking about exhibitions, is the way that history has a very meaningful way of aligning itself with contemporary conversations, if you know how to find that or look for it. And today here, I have to say one of the things that makes me feel most proud is the feeling that Elizabeth Catlett has come home.
My question is, when Elizabeth Catlett there, I know she was managing US for a very long time, about 40 years. Was she ever banned, or was she able to come back to the US? Yeah.
Yeah. It's a fascinating story. So as a member of the Taller de Gráfica Popular, during the Cold War, both Mexican and US governments became, more concerned around activism that was considered to be communist. Eventually, the US government deemed the TGP a communist organization. And a number of sort of leftist Americans were living in Mexico at the time. And essentially, a number of them were arrested. Catlett was arrested in, I think, 1958, literally taken out of her home while her children were there and her husband was away. And so because she was arrested, but she had her whole life in Mexico at that point. She has 3 babies, She's not going to go back she's not going to allow herself to be deported back to the United States. So she begins the process of becoming a Mexican citizen. And that process was complete by 1962. The minute she becomes a Mexican citizen, the US government then declares her an undesirable alien. For the next 9 years from 1962 to 1971, she was denied a visa. Every time she tried to go to the United States, they would deny it. Her mother was in the hospital getting surgery. They denied her visa. And in fact, she learned that there were people kind of lurking near the hospital to see if she would go anyway. Then the title comes from a time when she tried to go to a conference in Chicago and her visa was denied. So it's not until 1971 when the Studio Museum in Harlem organizes a retrospective of her work, or not exactly retrospective, but a major show, and they managed to get a visa. And from that point on, she's able to travel, but her citizenship was not restored until 2002. And so in that time, yes, she's traveling. She buys a home here in the United States in New York City, but she loses opportunities. Like, for example, she had basically won a commission to do a portrait of Martin Luther King for the Capitol, but they would revoke that when they realized she's not an American citizen. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, thank you very much. Waiting for the mic to go.
Yeah. It's okay. It's not my best. I was like, it's crazy. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Thanks. So good to see you. Yes. It's great to hear more. I thought it was going to be perfect the other night.